Detective Inspector James Morrison had been working as a security expert for the royal family for 15 years. He had seen many secrets, heard many whispers, and kept many confidences. But nothing had prepared him for what he would discover on a cold Tuesday morning in March. The call came at 6:30 a.m. Camilla's personal assistant, Sarah, was in tears on the phone. "James, you need to come quickly. The Queen Consort's phone is missing, and there's a security concern." Within 20 minutes, James was at the royal residence, his mind racing through possible scenarios. Missing royal phones were serious business. They contained sensitive information, private conversations, and details that could damage the monarchy if they fell into the wrong hands. Sarah met him at the entrance, her face pale and drawn. "I found her phone in the garden this morning," she whispered. "It was just lying there by the rose bushes. The screen was cracked, and it looked like it had been there all night." James carefully examined the device. The phone was a special encrypted model used by senior royals, but the damage was concerning. Water had seeped through the cracked screen, and the battery was completely dead. "When did the Queen Consort last have her phone?" James asked, pulling out his equipment. "Yesterday evening. She was in her private study, and then she went for a walk in the gardens after dinner. She seemed upset about something, but she wouldn't say what." James connected the phone to his specialized recovery equipment. As a security expert, he had access to tools that could retrieve data even from severely damaged devices. The royal family's safety often depended on understanding potential security breaches. As the data began to transfer, James reassured Sarah. "Don't worry. We'll recover whatever we can and make sure there's no security risk. Has anyone else been in the garden since yesterday?" "Only the gardening staff this morning. They're the ones who found it and brought it to me." The recovery process took 2 hours. James worked methodically, extracting every piece of data from the damaged device. Text messages, call logs, photos, emails, encrypted communications. Everything was being carefully retrieved and analyzed. When the process was complete, James began his standard security review. He needed to check for any signs that the device had been compromised, any unauthorized access, or any communications that might pose a security risk. He started with the recent call logs. Nothing unusual there. Calls to family members, staff, and a few trusted friends. The photos were mostly family pictures and images from recent royal events. But when he opened the text message folder, something caught his attention. There were several message threads that had been recently deleted. In his experience, people only deleted messages when they contained something they didn't want others to see. Using his recovery tools, James began to restore these deleted conversations. The first few were harmless. Messages about scheduling appointments, reminders about events, casual conversations with friends. But then he found a thread that made him stop and read more carefully. The messages were between Camilla and someone saved in her contacts simply as M. The conversation had been going on for months, and the tone was intimate and personal in a way that made James uncomfortable. "I can't keep pretending everything is fine," one message read. "This situation is tearing me apart." "We need to talk soon. There are things you need to know before it's too late," came the reply. James felt his stomach tighten. As a security professional, he had a duty to investigate anything that might compromise the royal family's safety or reputation. But as a human being, he was reluctant to invade someone's private communications. He continued reading, hoping the messages would prove to be innocent. But the more he read, the more concerned he became. "If this comes out, it will destroy everything we've built," Camilla had written. "The truth has a way of surfacing eventually. We need to control how this story is told," M had responded. James realized he was looking at something much more serious than a simple security breach. These messages suggested some kind of secret that could have major implications for the royal family. His hands trembled slightly as he continued to scroll through the recovered messages. There were references to "that night in 1987" mentions of documents that must never be found, and discussions about protecting Charles from the truth. One message in particular made James's blood run cold. If anyone ever discovers what really happened, it won't just end my marriage. It could bring down the entire monarchy. James sat back in his chair, staring at the screen. In 15 years of security work, he had never encountered anything like this. He was looking at what appeared to be evidence of a secret so dangerous that it could threaten the very foundation of the British royal family. The phone buzzed with an incoming call. It was Sarah. "James, how much longer will the analysis take? Her Majesty is asking about the phone, and I need to give her an update." "I'm almost finished," James replied, though his voice sounded strange even to his own ears. "I'll have a full report shortly." But James knew that his report would never include what he had just discovered. The question now was what he should do with this information. As he continued to read through the messages, a clearer picture began to emerge. The mysterious M appeared to be someone with intimate knowledge of royal family history. The conversations referenced events and people that only someone very close to the family would know about. One message thread from just a week ago was particularly troubling. "The journalist has been asking questions. He's getting too close to the truth." "Which journalist?" "David Mitchell from The Times. He's been investigating the 1987 incident. Someone must have talked." "We need to handle this carefully. One wrong move and everything comes crashing down." James realized he was not just looking at personal secrets, but at what appeared to be an active cover-up of something that had happened decades ago. Something involving a journalist who was apparently getting close to exposing whatever truth Camilla and this mysterious contact were desperate to hide. The weight of what he had discovered began to settle on his shoulders. He was now in possession of information that could potentially destroy the royal family, end marriages, and shake the British monarchy to its core. But he was also a man of integrity who had sworn to protect the royal family. The question was, did protecting them mean burying this information forever, or did it mean ensuring that whatever dangerous secret they were hiding didn't eventually explode and cause even greater damage? James saved all the recovered data to an encrypted drive and carefully wiped the analysis equipment clean. He needed time to think, time to decide what the right course of action would be. As he prepared to leave the security office, one final message caught his eye. It was the last communication in the thread, sent just yesterday evening, shortly before Camilla had gone for her walk in the garden. "Tomorrow, we end this once and for all. Meet me at the old location at midnight. Bring everything." James Morrison spent a sleepless night staring at the ceiling of his small apartment. The encrypted drive containing Camilla's recovered messages sat locked in his personal safe, but the weight of its contents pressed heavily on his mind. By morning, he had made a decision that went against every protocol he had ever learned. He was going to investigate further. James arrived at work early, before most of the royal staff had begun their day. He used his security clearance to access the palace archives, something he had never done for personal reasons before. If the messages were referring to an incident in 1987, there might be official records that could help him understand what he was dealing with. The archive room was dusty and quiet, filled with decades of carefully organized files. James found the section for 1987 and began searching through incident reports, travel logs, and security briefings. For the first hour, he found nothing unusual. But then, buried in a file marked Confidential Security Matters, he discovered something that made his hands shake. There was a report dated September 15, 1987, written by the head of security at the time. It described an incident requiring immediate containment involving a member of the royal family and potential threats to the stability of the crown. Most of the details had been redacted, but one line remained clear. All evidence secured. Matter resolved. No further action required. The report was signed by Sir Frederick Hamilton, who had been head of royal security until his sudden death in 1988. James had heard whispers about Sir Frederick over the years, stories about his absolute loyalty to the crown and his reputation for making problems disappear completely. James photographed the document with his phone and continued searching. In another file, he found travel records showing that Camilla had made an unexpected trip to Scotland in September 1987, staying at a remote castle for 2 weeks with no official engagements scheduled. The pieces of a puzzle were starting to form, but James still couldn't see the complete picture. He needed to understand who M was and what exactly had happened in 1987 that was still threatening the royal family nearly 40 years later. That afternoon, James made another decision that violated every rule in his professional handbook. He decided to track down David Mitchell, the journalist mentioned in the messages. Finding Mitchell wasn't difficult. A quick internet search revealed that he was an investigative reporter for the Times with a reputation for exposing scandals involving powerful families. James called the newspaper's main number and asked to speak with Mitchell, claiming to have information about a story the journalist was working on. They agreed to meet at a small coffee shop in central London, away from anywhere James might be recognized as royal staff. David Mitchell was a thin man in his 50s with sharp eyes and graying hair. He looked like someone who had spent decades uncovering secrets that powerful people wanted to keep hidden. "You said you had information about a story I'm investigating," Mitchell said without preamble as soon as James sat down. "What story would that be?" James chose his words carefully. "I believe you've been looking into something that happened in 1987. Something involving the royal family." Mitchell's expression became very still. "Who are you?" "Someone who wants to understand the truth." "The truth about what, specifically?" James realized he was at a crossroads. Once he shared what he knew, there would be no going back. But the weight of the secret was becoming unbearable. "I think you know about an incident that happened in September 1987. Something that certain people are very desperate to keep hidden." Mitchell leaned back in his chair, studying James carefully. After a long moment, he spoke. "3 weeks ago, I received an anonymous letter containing a partial document. It suggested that in 1987, there was a cover-up involving the royal family that has never been exposed. The document was incomplete, but it contained enough details to convince me that something significant happened." "What kind of cover-up?" "The letter suggested that someone died, and that the circumstances were covered up to protect the royal family from scandal, but I haven't been able to verify any of the details." James felt the coffee shop spinning around him. Someone had died. The messages between Camilla and M suddenly took on a much darker meaning. "Did the letter say who died?" James asked quietly. "A woman named Margaret Hartwell. She was apparently a staff member at one of the royal residences. The official records show she died in a car accident while on holiday in Scotland. But the letter suggested that wasn't the truth. Margaret Hartwell." Sir James realized with growing horror that M in Camilla's phone wasn't a person at all. It was a reference to Margaret Hartwell, someone who was supposed to be dead. "Have you tried to verify whether Margaret Hartwell is actually dead?" James asked. Mitchell nodded. "That's where it gets interesting. I found the death certificate and the accident report from 1987. Everything appears to be in order. But when I tried to find the cemetery where she was supposedly buried, it doesn't exist. The address on the burial records leads to an empty lot that was never a cemetery." James's mind raced. If Margaret Hartwell wasn't really dead, then who had Camilla been texting? And why was someone who was supposed to have died in 1987 still alive and apparently in contact with the Queen Consort? "There's something else," Mitchell continued. "I've been getting the feeling that I'm being watched. Phone calls where no one speaks, cars following me, that sort of thing. Someone really doesn't want me investigating this story." James thought about the messages he had read, particularly the ones discussing how to handle Mitchell's investigation. Someone was indeed trying to stop the journalist from uncovering the truth. "What exactly do you think happened in 1987? James asked. Mitchell glanced around the coffee shop before answering. "Based on the fragments I've been able to piece together, I believe Margaret Hartwell witnessed something she shouldn't have, something involving someone very high up in the royal family. Instead of dealing with the potential scandal, they faked her death and have been keeping her hidden ever since." "Hidden where?" "I don't know. But I think she's been in contact with various royal family members over the years, possibly as some sort of insurance policy. If something happened to her, or if she felt threatened, she might have ways to expose whatever she witnessed." James felt sick. The implications were staggering. If Mitchell was right, then the royal family had been living with this secret for decades, and Margaret Hartwell had been essentially held captive by her own knowledge. "Why are you telling me all this?" James asked. "You don't even know who I am." Mitchell smiled grimly. "Because you clearly know more than you're telling me, and because I think you might be the key to finally getting to the truth." James stood up abruptly. This conversation had gone much further than he had intended. "I need to think about this." "Wait," Mitchell called as James started to leave. "If you do know something, please consider coming forward. Whatever happened in 1987, keeping it buried isn't protecting anyone anymore. It's just perpetuating an injustice." James left the coffee shop with his head spinning. When he returned to the palace that afternoon, everything looked different. The corridors he had walked thousands of times suddenly felt like they were hiding dark secrets. The portraits of past royals seemed to watch him with knowing eyes. That evening, James made his most dangerous decision yet. He returned to Camilla's recovered messages and found the reference to the old location. Using his security access, he pulled up historical records of properties associated with the royal family. After hours of searching, he found what he was looking for. In 1987, the royal family had maintained a small private cottage in the Scottish Highlands that was used for unofficial retreats. The property had been quietly sold in 1988 and was now listed as a private residence. James cross-referenced this with Camilla's travel records from 1987 and found a match. She had been in Scotland during the time when Margaret Hartwell supposedly died in a car accident. As James prepared to leave the palace that night, he received an unexpected visitor. Sarah, Camilla's assistant, appeared in his office looking nervous and frightened. "James, I need to tell you something," she whispered. "About yesterday, when we found the Queen Consort's phone." "What about it?" "She didn't just lose it during her walk. I saw her throw it into the garden. She was in her study, crying and talking to someone on the phone. Then she suddenly screamed, 'No! I can't do this anymore!' and threw the phone through the window." James felt his blood turn cold. "Did you hear anything else?" "Just before she threw the phone, I heard her say, 'Margaret, please don't make me choose between my family and doing what's right.'" The name hit James like a physical blow. Sarah had just confirmed that Margaret Hartwell was not only alive, but was in direct contact with Camilla. And whatever Margaret wanted was causing Camilla enough distress to make her destroy her own phone rather than continue the conversation. As Sarah left his office, James realized that the situation was far more urgent than he had understood. Something was coming to a head, and he was running out of time to decide what role he would play in whatever was about to unfold. The recovered message about meeting at the old location at midnight suddenly took on new urgency. If his theory about the Scottish cottage was correct, then something significant was happening there very soon, and James had to decide whether he was going to try to stop it or help expose the truth that had been buried for nearly 4 decades. James Morrison stood at the crossroads of his career and his conscience as he drove through the Scottish Highlands under cover of darkness. He had made the most difficult decision of his life. He was going to the cottage to witness whatever was about to unfold between Camilla and Margaret Hartwell. The old cottage sat isolated among rolling hills, exactly as the archived property records had described. As James approached, he could see lights in the windows and 2 cars parked outside. His heart pounded as he realized he was about to come face to face with a woman who had been officially dead for 36 years. James parked his car a safe distance away and approached the cottage on foot. Through a window, he could see 2 figures sitting across from each other at a small table. One was unmistakably Camilla. The other was a woman with silver hair and a face that showed the weight of decades carrying an unbearable secret. James positioned himself where he could hear their conversation while remaining hidden. What he heard would change everything he thought he knew about the royal family. "Margaret, please," Camilla was saying, her voice thick with emotion. "I was 19 years old. I didn't know what else to do." "You let them tell the world I was dead, Camilla. For 36 years I've been a ghost. No family, no life, no identity. All to protect your secret." "It wasn't just my secret. You know that." Margaret Hartwell leaned forward, her eyes blazing with anger and pain. "Charles was there that night too, wasn't he? Both of you were at the estate when it happened." James strained to hear as Camilla's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "We were young and foolish. The party got out of hand, people were drinking, someone brought drugs. When that man fell from the balcony—" "He didn't fall, Camilla. Charles pushed him." The words hung in the air, like a death sentence. James felt the world tilt around him as the full truth finally emerged. "It was an accident," Camilla protested. "They were fighting about money, about Charles' gambling debts. The man was threatening to go to the press. Charles just wanted him to back off, but the man was drunk and aggressive." "And I saw everything," Margaret said quietly. "I was serving drinks when it happened. I watched the future King of England push a man to his death, and then I watched both of you decide to cover it up." James's hands trembled as he listened. The incident in 1987 wasn't just a scandal. It was a death that had been covered up at the highest levels of the British royal family. "Sir Frederick said it was the only way," Camilla continued. "If the truth came out, it would have destroyed Charles, destroyed the monarchy. You agreed to disappear in exchange for financial security and protection. I was 23 years old and terrified. I didn't understand what I was agreeing to. Sir Frederick told me it would be temporary, just until things calmed down. I've been living in hiding for nearly 4 decades. Margaret stood up abruptly, pulling a thick envelope from her bag. "Do you know what this is, Camilla?" "Please don't." "It's everything. Photos I took that night before Sir Frederick confiscated my camera, copies of documents I made, witness statements I wrote, everything I need to prove that Thomas Morrison didn't die in a gambling dispute gone wrong, but was murdered by the man who is now our king." James gasped. Thomas Morrison. The victim shared his surname. As the implications hit him, Margaret continued speaking. "Thomas was my brother, Camilla. My older brother who was trying to help Charles with his gambling debts out of loyalty to the crown. And Charles killed him for it." The personal connection explained everything. Why Margaret had stayed silent for so long, why she had finally decided to speak out, and why she had been in contact with Camilla recently. "I'm dying," Margaret said simply. "Cancer. The doctors give me 3 months. I can't take this secret to my grave knowing that my brother's killer sits on the throne of England." Camilla was crying now, deep sobs that shook her entire body. "Margaret, please, think about what this will do, not just to Charles and me, but to William, to Harry, to the grandchildren. The monarchy will fall." "Maybe it should," Margaret replied coldly. "Maybe a crown built on lies and murder doesn't deserve to survive." "What do you want?" Camilla asked desperately. "I want the truth told. I want my brother's name cleared." He's been portrayed as a gambling addict who got violent with royalty. But he was a good man trying to help, and he deserves better. Margaret placed the envelope on the table. I've already given copies to David Mitchell at the Times. If anything happens to me, or if you try to silence me again, everything goes public immediately. James realized he was witnessing the final moments of a royal cover-up that had lasted for decades, but he also realized that Margaret was right. The truth needed to come out, no matter the consequences. As the conversation continued inside, James made his own decision. He pulled out his phone and called David Mitchell. "It's the man you met yesterday," James said when Mitchell answered. "I'm at the Scottish cottage. Everything you suspected is true, and more. Margaret Hartwell is alive. And she has evidence that Charles killed her brother in 1987. "Where are you exactly?" Mitchell asked, his voice sharp with excitement. James gave him the address. "Come now. Bring a camera crew if you can. This story is about to break whether the royal family wants it to or not." Inside the cottage, the conversation was reaching its climax. Margaret had stood up and was preparing to leave. "I've waited 36 years for justice for my brother," she said to Camilla. "I won't wait any longer. The story will run in tomorrow's edition of the Times. The whole world will know what Charles did and what you helped him cover up." "Margaret, wait!" Camilla called out desperately. But Margaret was already walking toward the door. As Margaret stepped outside, she found herself face to face with James. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Margaret smiled sadly. "You're the security officer who found the phone, aren't you?" James nodded. "I know everything. I read the messages. I spoke to the journalist. I know about your brother. Are you here to stop me?" James looked at this woman who had sacrificed her entire life to protect a terrible secret. "No, I'm here to make sure you're safe." At that moment, David Mitchell's car pulled up the drive, followed by a van with camera equipment. Margaret looked at the arriving journalists, then back at James. "Thank you," she said simply. The next morning, the story that had been buried for 36 years exploded across the front page of every newspaper in Britain and around the world. "Murder at the Palace. How the royal family covered up a death for decades," read the headline in the Times. Margaret Hartwell's interview, supported by photographs, documents, and witness statements, told the complete story of Thomas Morrison's death and the elaborate cover-up that followed. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. King Charles abdicated within a week, unable to maintain his position in the face of the evidence. Camilla disappeared from public life entirely. The monarchy entered the deepest crisis in its history as Parliament debated whether the institution could survive such a scandal. James Morrison was dismissed from his position immediately, but he felt no regret. He had chosen truth over loyalty, justice over protection of the powerful. He received death threats and hate mail, but he also received messages of support from people around the world who believed he had done the right thing. 6 months later, James received a letter forwarded through his lawyer. It was from Margaret Hartwell, who was living her final months in a small cottage by the sea, finally free to use her real name and live openly for the first time in decades. "Dear James," the letter read, "I wanted to thank you for your courage. Because of your decision to support the truth rather than protect the institution, my brother's name has been cleared, and justice has finally been served. I can die in peace knowing that the truth has been told. The monarchy may survive this crisis or it may not, but either way, it will be built on honesty rather than lies. That is a better foundation for any institution. With gratitude and respect, Margaret." James kept the letter in his wallet. It reminded him that sometimes the right choice is also the hardest choice, but that in the end, truth and justice matter more than power and privilege. The royal family eventually rebuilt itself around William and Catherine, who worked tirelessly to restore public trust through transparency and genuine service. The monarchy survived, but it was forever changed by the revelation that had been hidden for so long. And in a small cemetery in Scotland, a new headstone was placed next to the graves of Thomas Morrison's parents. For the first time in 36 years, Margaret's brother was properly remembered and honored, his true story finally told. James often visited that cemetery, reflecting on the events that had changed his life and the course of British history. He never regretted his decision to choose truth over loyalty, even when it cost him everything he had built in his career. Sometimes he knew doing the right thing requires sacrificing everything else. But in the end, it was the only choice that allowed him to sleep peacefully at night, knowing that justice had finally been served for a good man who had died trying to help his future king, only to be betrayed and forgotten until one brave woman decided that 36 years of silence was enough.